So I'll be talking with you all a little bit, as Lori said, about risk and protective factors. First of all, we'll just start with an actual definition of suicide. And so according to the CDC Injury Center, suicide is defined as death caused by self-directed injurious behavior with any intent to die as a result of the behavior. That's to be distinguished from a suicide attempt, which is a non-fatal, meaning the person did not succeed in that attempt to kill themselves. Self-directed and potentially injurious behavior with any intent to die as a result of the behavior. It may or may not result in an injury. We also have suicidal ideation, which is another term you may hear, and that's when a person is actually thinking about, considering, or planning for suicide. All right, so I'm talking to you about risk and protective factors, so let's start with the definition of what a risk factor is. So according to the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, risk factors are characteristics that make it more likely that individuals will consider, attempt, or die by suicide. It's important to note that a risk factor does not mean that a person will attempt or will commit suicide. It just means they have more of a likelihood. There's some reason that there's more of a likelihood that this may occur for them. So they can be different types. They can be biological, they can be psychological, they can be environmental, or they can be social cultural. And we'll talk as we go through the list of risk factors, we'll know which ones of those kind of fall into these areas. All right, so here's some risk factors for you to be aware of. Prior suicide attempts is one of the major risk factors when thinking about who might be more likely to try to commit suicide or be successful in committing a suicide. A family history of suicide is also found to be a risk factor. And also I should note that the way you might be wondering kind of how they figure out what's a risk factor, what's a protective factor, they actually may look at individuals who've attempted suicide or who've histories of those who committed suicide and find that they may have more of these characteristics, more of these things may have been present in their lives than other individuals who did not. A history of abuse is a huge risk factor. Often people are in a tremendous amount of pain as a result of that, and so that's something to be aware of. A history of mental disorders, particularly a mood disorder, is another risk factor. Barriers to accessing mental health treatment is another risk factor. It's important for people to get the help they need in preventing suicide. Easy access to, that should say lethal, not legal means. Easy access to lethal means is another factor. So if there's firearms in the home, if there's old prescription pills, you may have heard something about that. Anything that would give a person easy access, particularly for our adolescents, that's something to pay attention to. A physical illness may cause a person so much distress that they feel a tendency that they might want to attempt suicide. Loss or grief is also a vulnerable time for individuals. And feelings of isolation, that's a huge one. You'll see we'll talk about the converse of that when we look at our protective factors. Also, a history of alcohol and substance abuse is found to be correlated with suicide. And impulsive and aggressive tendencies. And some of you may know that for our teenagers, they're particularly impulsive at this age, and so that's something we really want to look at for them. Here's one that's a biggie, which is a huge, huge barrier. An unwillingness to seek help because of fear, stigma, and or shame is another risk factor. So just like risk factors, protective factors can be biological, psychological, environmental, or sociocultural. A protective factor is defined as a characteristic that makes it less likely that an individual will consider, attempt, or die by suicide. And that's according to the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. So like a risk factor, a protective factor just means that it's something that's in place to kind of help safeguard individuals. So here's some. One, and a huge one that you've probably heard, and I plugged a whole lot last week as we were talking about Suicide Prevention Awareness Week, is connectedness. A huge prevention factor and a reason why the Safe Schools program is here in the schools, a reason why I'm here in the schools, a reason why it's good for kids to be connected to their teachers, etc., is that connectedness to individuals, their family, community, and social institutions, particularly school, since this is where they spend so much time, that's a huge protective factor for kids. Access to and effective implementation of clinical care for mental, physical, and substance abuse disorders is another protective factor. That's the converse of what we saw earlier. Restricted access to lethal means of suicide, again, that's a protective factor. And actually, in terms of cognitive ability or problem-solving ability, skills that a person has in solving problems and conflict resolution and in nonviolence, so the opposite of the aggressive behaviors we saw earlier, that's another good protective factor. And finally, cultural beliefs that support instincts for self-preservation. So if a person comes from an environment, it may be a religious practice, it may be a personal belief in their family, whatever, that really promotes life and the goodness of life and the fact that there's hope, that's a good protective factor as well. All right, so I'm concerned that someone I know may be thinking about committing suicide. What should I do? That question can be answered a little bit more by our next panelist, so I'm going to turn it back over to Lori.